Joe Heschmeyer quoted the condemnation, then answered a different charge. The religious liberty contradiction he set out to dissolve is sitting inside the very passage he read aloud. By Chris D. In his video, The Critical Disagreements That Sparked the SSPX Schism, Joe Heschmeyer takes up 3 alleged errors of Vatican II and says the Society of St. Pius IX makes its strongest case on religious liberty. He is right about that. He then reads the decisive text aloud. At about 3152, he quotes Pius IX's 1864 encyclical Quanta, Cura, condemning those who teach that the best condition of civil society is one in which no duty is recognized as attached to the civil power of restraining by enacted penalties offenders against the Catholic religion, except so far as public peace may require. Read that condemned proposition slowly. It is not about a man's inner freedom to believe what he likes. It is about whether civil authority has any duty to restrain public offenses against the Catholic religion, and it says that a public peace standard is too narrow a limit. Pius IX condemned a claim about civil non-restraint. Strip out the double negatives, and he is teaching the reverse. In a rightly ordered state, civil rulers have a duty to protect the Catholic religion by restraining, with laws and penalties, those who publicly attack it, and not only when the attack disturbs the peace. Nor is the condemnation a stray remark. The encyclical went out the same day as the famous syllabus of errors, and it closes with a formal act. By our apostolic authority, we reprobate, prescribe, and condemn all the singular and evil opinions and doctrines severally mentioned in this letter, and will and command that they be thoroughly held by all children of the Catholic Church as reprobated, prescribed, and condemned. Whatever theological weight one assigns that sentence, it is a pope commanding the whole Church to hold a proposition about civil power as condemned. Joe and I are both children of the Catholic Church. That command is addressed to us. Then, beginning at about 3404, Joe answers a different claim. He argues that the 19th century popes condemned an Enlightenment positive right to error, rooted in religious indifferentism, while Dignitatis Humanae teaches only a negative immunity from coercion. That distinction is real, and I will grant it in full. It simply is not what Quanta Cura condemned in the sentence he had just finished reading. A disclosure before the argument starts. I am not a member of the SSPX, and I think the Society went too far on July 1st, 2026, when its bishops consecrated 4 new bishops without a pontifical mandate and against Pope Leo XIV's expressly stated will. Nothing here defends those consecrations. The question in this article is not whether the SSPX acted rightly in July, but whether the 2 operative rules can both be true. One question decides this strip away the vocabulary, and the whole dispute reduces to a single case. In a Catholic country, a missionary of a false religion rents a hall, prints literature, and preaches in public to adults who come willingly. He uses no fraud, no threats, and no indecent methods. He disturbs no one's peace, violates nobody's rights, and commits no offense against public morality apart from the falsity of what he teaches. He is simply persuading Catholics, one hall at a time, to abandon the faith that saves them. May civil authority restrain peaceful public false proselytism solely because it is false and harms the religious common good. The older doctrine answers yes in principle, while adding that prudence may counsel, and sometimes even require toleration. Dignitatis Humanae answers no. Restraint for religious falsity alone is excluded while just public order is observed. One ruler, one hall, one afternoon, and 2 contrary answers. Tolerating something is not the same as having a right to it. The whole argument turns on this distinction, so here is one plain illustration. A tenant is in breach of his lease. The landlord has grounds to evict him and declines to do it, because eviction would cost more than it is worth. Now change one fact. The tenant holds a valid lease he has not broken, so the landlord may not evict him at all except on the narrow grounds the lease allows. Watch the building for a year, and you see the same thing either way. The tenant stays, but the legal reason is opposite, and the legal reason is the entire fight. In the first case, the landlord holds the power and forbears. That is toleration, which presupposes a real disorder with no claim of its own, and leaves it alone because interference would cost more than it gains. In the second case, the landlord has no such power because the tenant holds a title that obliges him to keep his hands off. So when a defender of the council points out that the older popes also permitted broad toleration, he has not answered anything. Everyone agrees the tenant usually stayed. The question is who held the power to evict. What the older rule actually was. The older doctrine never taught that rulers must crush every false religious act. It taught something more precise, and the precision is what makes it hard to evade. St. Thomas Aquinas, in the Summa Theologiae de Secund, question 10, holds that unbelievers who never received the faith must by no means be compelled to believe, since belief depends on the will. In the same article, he adds that they may be restrained from hindering the faith by blasphemy, by evil persuasion, or by open persecution. 3 articles later, he explains that human government may tolerate the rights of unbelievers for the sake of some good that follows, or some evil avoided. Leo III gives the identical structure in Libertas 33 and 34. The Church concedes no right to anything but what is true and honest, yet she does not forbid public authority to tolerate what departs from truth and justice in order to avoid a greater evil or secure a greater good. He then adds the sentence that fixes the category. Such toleration must be confined to the limits its justifying cause requires, and the more a state is driven to tolerate evil, the further it stands from perfection. Pius X said the same thing as late as 1953 in his address Chi Ries, and said it in 2 parts that must be kept together. What does not correspond to truth or the moral norm objectively has no right to exist, to spread, or to be put into action. Yet failure to impede it by civil law and coercion can still be justified in the interest of a higher and more general good. That is one doctrine with 2 moving parts. Error holds no title of its own, and the ruler's power over it is governed by the common good rather than exercised at will. Non-interference comes from circumstances, not from a claim the false religion carries in its pocket. None of this obliges anyone to defend every law, prosecution, or punishment carried out in Christendom. Authority can exist and be abused, and a cruel or counterproductive penalty proves imprudence in the case rather than incompetence in the office. The traditional claim is about who holds the power, not about how wisely it was always used. What the Council put in its place, Dignitatis Humanae I, says the Declaration leaves untouched traditional Catholic doctrine on the moral duty of men and societies toward the true religion and toward the one Church of Christ. That sentence deserves full weight, and it rules out the crude charge that the Council taught indifferentism. It also raises a question the Declaration never answers. Which parts of that traditional doctrine are left untouched? Societies owed the true religion more than ceremony in the older teaching. They owed it protection, and protection included shielding the faithful from public assaults on their faith. A defender who takes Section 1 seriously has to say whether that duty survives, and if it does not, in what sense the doctrine was left untouched. The operative sections then reverse the starting point. Section 2 grounds a right to immunity from coercion in the dignity of the human person, extends it to private and public acts, alone and in association, and adds the clause that decides the case. The right to this immunity continues to exist even in those who do not live up to their obligation of seeking the truth and adhering to it, provided just public order is observed. The rest follows from that. Section 3 says, government transgresses its limits if it presumes to command or inhibit religious acts. Section 4 extends the same freedom to religious communities for public worship, self-government, teaching, and witness. Section 7 requires legal limits to conform to the objective moral order and locates the grounds for restraint in the rights of others, conflicts of rights, genuine public peace, and the guardianship of public morality. Notice what is absent from that list. Joe stresses correctly that the sealing is not a merely secular public order. At about 3817, he points to the higher standard of the objective moral order, and the Catechism, section 2109, adds that the right cannot be limited only by a public order conceived in positivist terms, and that its due limits must be judged by political prudence according to the common good. All of that is really in the texts, and it is his best card. It still does not make religious falsity itself a ground for restraint. Section 2 keeps the right alive precisely in those who reject religious truth, and Section 4 covers public teaching and witness. If being false were enough to forfeit the immunity, false religions would be protected only when they stopped acting publicly like religions. That leaves the defense with a choice, and both branches cost him. Read the objective moral order broadly enough to cover our test case, and the apparent contradiction may dissolve. But it dissolves only by writing into the Council's immunity a major limitation Joe would have to establish from the text, one that carries the new right most of the way back toward the older rule of conditional toleration. read it as sections 2, 4, and 7 appear to require, and the contradiction stands. Joe himself summarizes the council's right at about 38-37 as formulated specifically as a limitation upon the coercive power of the state. That is an accurate summary. It is also the difficulty, because the power being limited is the same power Quanta Cura said the civil ruler had a duty to use. 3 moves, and why none of them lands, the positive right distinction. Nobody in this argument claims Dignitatis Humanae teaches a moral license to embrace error, and the Catechism states in section 2108 that the right to religious liberty is neither a moral license to adhere to error nor a supposed right to error. Grant the whole distinction, it answers a proposition about moral authorization, while Pius IX condemned a proposition about the civil power's duty to restrain. A negative immunity is a claim against restraint, which is the same juridical field the older condemnation occupied. The distinction is true and it misses. Forced baptism and the search warrant. At about 36-49, Joe illustrates immunity with the Fourth Amendment and with the rule that parents may not be compelled to baptize their child, citing Aquinas correctly. Both examples are sound and both are conceded instantly. The older tradition drew that line itself. Aquinas forbids compelling belief and permits restraining external acts that hinder the faith in the same question of the Summa. Proving that the state may not manufacture faith leaves untouched the question of whether it may restrain the public spread of error. Thomas Pink's agency theory. At about 38-43, Joe presents Pink's proposal that the older popes envisioned the state coercing as an agent of the church, while the council addresses the state acting on its own native authority. Joe calls it an intriguing hypothesis, notes that other scholars have pushed back forcefully, and says that whether Pink is right or not, the council's immunity runs against the coercive authority of the state while the church retains her own. That is candid, and it is also the problem. A theory Joe neither adopts nor establishes does not show that the texts have been reconciled. The theory also sits badly with the texts it must save. Leo XIII grounds the state's religious duties in nature and reason. Quanta Cura speaks of a duty attached to the civil power itself, and Dignitatis Humanae II describes immunity from any human power, with no agency exception stated. The shepherd's rod Joe then quotes from Benedict XVI concerns the church guarding her own flock against falsifiers of the faith and does not restore the civil competence at issue. Then comes the standard itself. At about 40-26, Joe concludes that several plausible harmonizations are available, and that showing several can be enough even when one cannot say which is correct, comparing the case to alleged Bible difficulties. Look at what the proposed harmonizations actually say. Pink says the Old and New texts concern the same coercive act under different sources of authority. The positive right theory says they concern different kinds of right. Others say the older rule was reformable policy that the council corrected. These cannot all be describing the same reconciliation, and that does not prove each one false. It proves that none has been demonstrated, which is the whole burden. What Joe has offered is a set of candidates, not a received teaching. The scripture comparison also breaks at the load-bearing point. Inspiration supplies a defined guarantee that both hard passages are true, so the interpreter's only task is to find a distinction the words will bear. Whether an equivalent protection covers this particular non-defining conciliar proposition is exactly what cannot be assumed here, since it is the thing in dispute. And even in Scripture, a merely imaginable story is no solution if the words exclude it. The missing demonstration is not a traditionalist talking point. John Courtney Murray, the American Jesuit usually credited as the Declaration's principal architect, wrote in the Abbott edition of the Council documents published the year after the Council closed that the notion of development, not the notion of religious freedom, was the real sticking point for many of those who opposed the Declaration even to the end, and that the course of the development between the syllabus of errors and the Declaration still remains to be explained by theologians. The man who drafted the text did not claim the reconciliation existed. He said someone would have to find it. So the question stands where it started. May civil authority restrain peaceful public false proselytism solely because it is false and harms the religious common good? The answer cannot be that times changed. The most natural reply from a thoughtful reader is that the 19th century faced revolutionary regimes bent on stripping the church, while the modern state is plural and mostly harmless, so a rule fit for one setting was replaced by a rule fit for the other. Everything in that reply is true, and none of it reaches the point. The older doctrine already had a gear for changed circumstances, and it was called toleration. Leo XIII used that gear in 1895 in Longinqua 6. He praised the American arrangement and noted that the church here was unfettered by hostile legislation, then added that it would be very erroneous to conclude that America shows the most desirable condition of the Church, since she would bear more abundant fruit with the favor of the laws and the patronage of public authority. Leo could admire the practice and still deny it was the norm, which is exactly what a prudential rule lets you do. That is the trouble with the changed circumstances defense. It explains beautifully why restraint might be unwise everywhere today. It cannot explain how an act that carried no claim against authority in 1864 came to carry a right grounded in human nature itself by 1965. Circumstances changed in that century. Human nature did not. The debate Joe recommends reveals the real fork. At the end of the segment, Joe points viewers, among other resources, to Thomas Pink's debate with Dr. Martin Ronheimer. That recommendation is generous and scholarly, and it is also the most damaging thing in the video, because the two sides of that debate do not offer two harmonizations. They disagree about whether harmonization is possible at all. Pink argues for strict continuity by way of the agency distinction. Ronheimer argues the opposite. In his account of the hermeneutic of reform, he writes that however one views the question, the conclusion is unavoidable. Precisely this teaching of the Second Vatican Council is what Pius IX condemned in Quanta, Cura. He places the discontinuity at the level of the Church's doctrine on the state, then defends the change as a correction of a historically conditioned application rather than a rupture in dogma. That is not a second harmonization. It is a concession of the contradiction plus an argument that the Council was entitled to make it. So the recommended debate maps the real fork rather than resolving it. One unproven theory of strict continuity and one candid theory of legitimate reversal. What follows if the reversal is admitted? Suppose Ronheimer is right, that the older civil rule was reformable and the Council replaced it. That position has the merit of honesty, and it comes with two bills. First, it grants the SSPX the narrower premise they are usually denied, that Vatican II changed the operative civil rule. The argument is no longer about whether the rule changed, but about whether it could be changed. That question turns on a reclassification, and the reclassification is where Ronheimer should be pressed. His case is not that the older teaching lacked a solemn definition. It is that the older doctrine on the state was a historically conditioned political application rather than a conclusion of natural law, so correcting it touches no dogma. Everything depends on that sorting, and the popes who taught the rule sorted it the other way. Pius IX introduced the condemned assertion as made against the doctrine of Scripture, of the Church, and of the Holy Fathers. That is a doctrinal tag, not a policy note. Leo III argued from nature, reason, and the proper ends of civil society, not from the circumstances of 19th century Europe. A defender who reclassifies their conclusion as contingent application owes us a criterion for doing so, and the criterion cannot be that the conclusion was later contradicted. Second, the method needs a principled stopping rule and has not been given one. If a sustained teaching can be reclassified as contingent application once a later text conflicts with it, the same move is available against any teaching including Dignitatis Humanae, which define nothing solemnly either. Meanwhile, the practical effect of the new rule is not neutral. Under the older doctrine, Catholic truth was the public norm and error asked for toleration. Under the new one, error begins with an immunity, and Catholic society must justify any restraint as an exception. The burden has changed hands, and truth now argues from the defensive. None of this requires calling Dignitatis Humanae heretical, and I have not. It requires admitting that two rules cannot both govern one case. Either the older doctrine was reformable political application and the Council replaced it, or it expressed a permanent principle that a non-defining declaration could not overturn. What is no longer available is the comfortable third answer, in which continuity is asserted while the test case goes unanswered. So, Joe, may a Catholic ruler restrain that peaceful missionary solely because his religion is false and harms souls? Answer yes, and just public order must include protection of the religious common good itself. That may preserve continuity, but only by narrowing the Council's immunity. Peaceful false proselytism is not protected merely because it is peaceful, and the older civil competence fits back inside the exception. Answer no, and the duty whose denial Pius IX reprobated, proscribed, and condemned has been denied again by a son of the Church to whom that command was addressed. The segment ends with several candidate reconciliations and no verdict, but the question will not accept that answer. It takes yes or no.